Awesome, thank you. So our speaker today for today's webinar is Brad Eichelberger. Brad is the Chief Geographic Information Officer at the CNMI Division of Fish and Wildlife, where he oversees the whole division's spatial data management systems. And he also serves as CNMI's focal point for the Pacific GIS and Remote Sensing Council. Brad has been working in Saipan since 2016, I believe. He's also adjunct faculty at the Northern Marianas College, where he's taught courses on natural resources management. And his current work is focused on the spatial ecology of threatened and endangered species in CNMI. So he's using remote sensing to monitor land cover change in CNMI and also conducting climate change vulnerability assessments for species of greatest concerns. Brad joined the Pacific RISCC core team last year, and he's representing the CNMI. And so today he's going to describe his recent research on the population trends and dynamics of CNMI's endemic birds over time. He'll be talking about the dual pressures of climate change and invasive species on CNMI's bird populations. So things like the brown tree snake, as well as introduced forest species, and how ongoing translocation efforts might help protect these rare and endangered species. So in just a moment, we'll turn it over to Brad to start the webinar, but I will be sure to leave time at the end of this session for your questions. But if you do need to jump off the webinar or you don't have access to your microphone, please feel free to start leaving your questions in the chat for us as we go, and we'll answer them at the end. And as you saw, the webinar is being recorded and it'll be posted after today's webinar on our website at pacificriscc.org. With that, Brad, I will turn it over to you.
Great. Thank you, Laura, for the introduction. And half a day, aloha, good morning, and thank you for joining the webinar today and giving me this opportunity to share some of the work that we're doing with the Division of Fish and Wildlife in the Northern Mariana Islands. I wanted to first start off by showing everyone where the Northern Mariana Islands are actually located at. We're a U.S. territory that is located just north of Guam at roughly about 15 degrees latitude, and in between, kind of sandwiched in between Japan and Papua New Guinea, and going from west to east, we're roughly in the middle of the Philippines and Hawaii. So we're an archipelago of 15 islands, and the lower 3 islands happen to be the most developed and most human populated, and those are the islands of Saipan, Tinian, and Rota, which we'll talk about more today. Everything north of Saipan is generally thought, generally called the Northern Islands, and these are more secluded, more remote, and generally uninhabited except for a few settlements that actually occur there. We're also situated in the typhoon beltway of Micronesia. So this map is essentially showing all the major typhoon events from the years 2000 to 2019, category 1 all the way up to category 5, which is considered the super typhoons. So a lot of the storms that brew in the Marshall Islands and the Federated States of Micronesia kind of gain momentum, rip through our general location, and we've experienced several severe typhoon events over the last 20 years. Some of the ones I'm going to be talking about today in particular is a class 3 typhoon event, Typhoon Sodalor, that went directly over the island of Saipan in 2015, as well as a category 5 super typhoon U2, which directly impacted Tinian and also Saipan as well. And was the largest storm ever recorded to hit U.S. soil. Our southernmost island of Rota, just north of Guam, has also experienced 2 category 2 typhoon events, one Fong Fong in 2014 and another Typhoon Mangat in 2018. So there's 4 substantial typhoon events that have hit our lower islands in the last 8 years. And you can see from these photos that the devastation can be quite substantial. Not only is the habitat greatly modified and there's structural damage, there's also structural damage to buildings. We've had power outages that lasted months following Typhoon Sodalor. and power and water interruptions in general. Generally speaking, the native vegetation that's found in the Marianas forests and jungles are believed to be typhoon resilient, and that's pretty much the reason why these species have survived so long on these islands that tend to be in this typhoon beltway. If we look at the capital island of Saipan, which has a population of roughly 44,000 people, and where I'm basically talking from today, the area is about 115 square kilometers or 45 square miles. This is our largest island. It's also under the most pressure from development. And if we zoom in and look at the landscape, we can see it's been highly modified. And this is largely in part due to World War II occupation for clearing for military operations, as well as the resulting bombardments from the battles that took place there. And this image is showing from 1945. You can really see that a lot of the landscape had been cleared and modified. And then what happened was, following World War II, all these areas were essentially reseeded with the invasive exotic species tongan or Leucaena leucocephala. And what this species actually does is it was probably brought in to stabilize soils and things along those lines, but it forms these really dense monocultural tongan thickets, but it also can invade into the forest and kind of set up shop essentially in the understory. So what we're looking at, rough estimates of 50% invasive species cover throughout the island of Saipan. So in terms of the tongan thickets, and then also what we're calling mixed introduced forests, is where we have tongan component, but maybe some other invasive species in there as well, such as acacia and albizia and things along those lines. The next island down is Tinian. It has a much smaller population of 2,000 people, and an area that's fairly comparable to the size of Saipan at 101 square kilometers or 39 square miles. Tinian suffered a similar fate during World War II, where it had been extensively cleared and reseeded with tongan. And we can see that over almost 60%, close to 60% of the land covers some sort of invasive species cover, either tongan thicket or the mixed introduced forest. The southernmost island, Rota, has a low population of 1,893 people. It's a little bit smaller. It's about 86 square kilometers or 33 square miles. And this island is been largely untouched. It was occupied during World War II, but much lower cover of invasive species that are currently on the landscape, and a lot more intact native limestone forests. The Northern Mariana Islands is also home to several endemic bird species that are not found anywhere else in the entire world. And several of these species are only found on very specific islands within the island chain. And this is one of our primary goals at being at the Division of Fish and Wildlife, is to ensure the safety and survival of these species. And if you happen to be a golden white-eye, like this little guy right here, there's only a few responses you may have to an actual typhoon event. So the first is you could be directly impacted by the typhoon. In that case, you could potentially perish. You could also be picked up and blown away with the typhoon winds, in which case, if you're lucky, you get deposited onto a nearby island where now you face a new home, and you have to kind of fight to set up your niche and survive on your new home. You could also be blown into the ocean, in which case a forest bird such as the golden white-eye is likely going to perish. These species also can take refuge, and they tend to show some resiliency in terms of hunkering down and riding out the storm. But with the aftermath of the destruction, you always run into the potential that there is no more food resources available to you, in which case starvation is a real concern, in which case you would also perish. So what I want to first talk about today is how long does it actually take for vegetation to recover after an extreme weather event, and are our native bird populations being impacted? So we know with some of the climate change projections, there's a potential for an increased frequency of severe weather events. We've certainly seen quite a few storms within the last 10 years occur on the islands. It kind of has us all wondering what's in store for us in the next couple of years. But we also have kind of an interesting sample design because we have 3 islands that have all had recent direct impacts, but the conditions vary just a little bit. So the largest island of Saipan has a lot more development pressure, is more populated, and also has a high degree of modified forest. Tinian has less human population, but is also a good example of a highly modified forest. And then Rota is less populated and seems to have fairly intact native forest. So to look at these 2 responses, I'm going to present data from the breeding bird data set, which is a 30-year-old data set that's been collected quarterly, so 4 times a year, at 50 listening stations per island on Saipan, Tinian, and Rota. And what happens here is a wildlife biologist will go out and conduct auditory and visual surveys for species abundance. So they're listening for a set period of time, and they're recording what species they hear and how many individuals that they hear at each station. And this is a great data set to look at the bird responses for pre and post typhoon events, particularly the ones that occurred within the last 8 years or so. It's important to split out these birds and categorize them based on their diets. So we're going to present data for carnivores, insectivores, and omnivores, which may have more food resources available to them following typhoon events, and also frugivores and nectivores, which are going to be highly dependent on the actual vegetation. To get an idea of how vegetation recovers, we're going to use vegetation indices that are derived from essentially satellite imagery, so Earth observation satellites. We're going to look at what's known as the Enhanced Vegetation Index, which is essentially a proxy for vegetation health. It basically is an index that looks at the greenness of the vegetation, and the idea there is that the greener the vegetation is, the healthier it is because there's more chloroplast production, and it seems to be photosynthesizing at a higher rate. So this EVI ranges from a -1 to +1, and healthy vegetation values are usually found between 0.2 to 0.8. The particular satellite I'm going to present data from is the Landsat 8 satellite, and that's going to be using 32-day composites of EVI, and we're actually going to look only at the same areas as the bird stations. So we're going to use the same sample points as where the birds were sampled at. And the idea there is, so whatever changes that we detect in bird populations, we're also still looking at the same block in terms of the vegetation. It's also important to split the vegetation out into 2 groups. So there is a dry season in the Northern Mariana Islands from December to June. And then we typically have a wet season where the typhoons would be more frequent between July and November. And we'll also look at precipitation data as a covariate. So the first question is, does the vegetation index and precipitation differ between dry and wet seasons? And we're going to look at Saipan as the example. So the graph that you see here is showing the average EVI for each dry season for each year in green, and then also the average daily precipitation in centimeters for that dry season per year. And you can really see that, which isn't very surprising, that the dry season vegetation indices follow the precipitation trends. The dry seasons tend to be hot and less rain. And obviously when the rain is good and the vegetation is water stressed, it's going to respond in a positive light when there's more water available. I've also included both the SOTOR and U2 events here to kind of give you a timeline, and you can see that there is a bit of a dip in terms of both EVI and precipitation immediately following those events. So the next dry season ended up being a little drier, and the vegetation was also lower. When we look at the wet season, and also again showing precipitation, we see these trend lines get a little bit more erratic. So immediately following the Sotalor event in 2016. So keep in mind, this is approximately 1 year later at this point. So it's the wet season for 2015 had the Sotalor event. We're looking at 2016. So roughly a year later, we still see a dip in the vegetation response, but the precipitation levels were up. And then as we move forward, we kind of see that the EVI and the precipitation are moving more in tandem. And then we get this kind of interesting dip in both around 2020, where the precipitation actually decreased that year, and it's kind of a low year. And we also see a response to the vegetation at that point. So the take-home message I want you to get out of this slide is that the years following typhoon events in 2016 and 2019 both had lower rainfall in the dry seasons, but they had fairly normal wet seasons. And then 2002 has this low rainfall during both seasons, and also the vegetation seems to kind of be responding to that. So what we're trying to get to is this question of how long does it take the vegetation to return to some sort of baseline business as usual kind of setting following a typhoon event. And what I want to do is first show you that we need to come up with some sort of threshold for determining the normal EVI and vegetation response. And the way we're going to do that is take the average of EVI for both the dry and the wet season separately from 2014 to 2021, and we're going to consider this business as usual. This does incorporate the typhoon events into that average, and if anything, I would say that we're probably lowballing our threshold at that point because we are including the typhoon events within this threshold. But the EVI index, the best data actually begins in 2014, so there wasn't any data that we could actually go prior to 2014 to kind of set this baseline. The little white error bars that you see on these means are actually the lower bounds of the 95% confidence intervals for the dry season in brown and the wet season in green. And if we actually draw a line across that lower bound, this is what we're going to consider the threshold for determining whether the vegetation is going to be responding back to business as usual. And we do the same for the green line here. We cross it across the lower bounds of the confidence interval. And next, we're going to plot the EVI for both dry and wet seasons for every year. And keep in mind, these are our thresholds. So anytime these means with their error bars for each year falls below these thresholds, we know that the vegetation doesn't seem to be normal. And anytime it's above, we're going to consider it back to normal, vegetation's recovered, things seem to be okay. And when we do that, I want you to just kind of follow the chronological order here. So we have 2014, way above the threshold. We have our Sotalor event in 2015, and here we have a dip in both the dry and wet season EVIs for one full year. We appear to have a recovery period. This one's a little low, but the error bar crosses the threshold, so we consider it being normal. And then we have our U2 event that happens in 2018, and we have a decrease once again in the dry season of 2019, a rebound. This weird year of 2020 where there was low precipitation, which might be explaining why it went back below the baseline. But the take-home message here is that there was one full recovery, at least on Saipan, following Typhoon Sotalor, and then after Typhoon U2, there's about a one dry season, 6-month recovery period. And then we have this kind of unusual 2020 situation going on where there was low precipitation. So now we're looking at a graph for Tinian, doing the exact same thing. If we set our thresholds for the wet season EVI and the dry season EVI, we basically see the exact same trend that we saw on Saipan, where there was one full year of recovery, followed by a 1 year dry season recovery after the U2 event. Moving on to Rota, keep in mind, these were exposed to different typhoon events, and now we're looking at Vongphong and Mangut. We set our thresholds, And the only time that we see any sort of vegetation response outside of the wet season where the typhoon event occurred is in 2015 following Vong Fong, and it seems to only be a recovery period of roughly 6 months or one dry season. So what's it all mean? So I know there's a lag time in recovery following typhoon events that were apparent on both Saipan and Tinian. We know that the precipitation was low in the dry seasons following those events, but the wet seasons were higher. So if anything, thinking that the already structurally damaged vegetation goes through a typhoon event, then experiences low precipitation, its following dry season, it may still be stressed and continue to be stressed. But there seemed to be the precipitation in the wet season following that to be higher. You would think that the vegetation would have recovered. So maybe there's a compounding event here with a typhoon event and then a drier dry season immediately following it. Saipan and Tinian exhibited similar patterns. And then we also have this kind of interesting 2020 dry year for Saipan and Tinian. And Rota had less intense typhoons. They were category 2s, but the recovery time was faster. So I want you to kind of remember these key thoughts when we move in to look at how the typhoons are impacting bird abundance on these islands. The first thing we're going to look at is bird abundance over time on Saipan. This is only for the carnivores, insectivores, and omnivores. So we'd split them separately if you recall. What you're basically looking at is a series of trend lines for each species. So each graph's a species. And we're using change point models that are using a negative binomial generalized linear model. So what this does is instead of fitting one trend line to a whole set of data points, it actually gives it some flexibility and uses some covariates to help model where there are changes in the trend line and kind of point out where these shifts actually happen. So if you look at one of these and you see these dashed lines, that's where all of a sudden the trend line following it and the trend line before it differ, and there's some changes happening. So what I'm going to do is add in the typhoon events in these magenta lines to kind of help visualize this a little bit better. And what you can see, at least on the 3 species here on the left, you see these typhoon events kind of coincide with some of these declines. So right here was a data point. Right after the typhoon event, we have a decline and then a little bit of a bump recovery, and then another typhoon event and a decline, and start basically seeing declines in some of these species. An easier way to kind of visualize all this is to have a species code to identify where these change points actually occur. So here I'm showing which species for each year experienced a shift in their population trend. And you can see they kind of coincide with some of these typhoon events. There's one large caveat that I want to make sure it's very clear. These changes may not necessarily equate to some sort of fatality in the bird population, but it simply means there's a change in detection for the abundance. So this could also be very much site related. So if we're looking at these bird stations, maybe the habitat around it got modified, maybe it experienced substantial typhoon damage, and the birds just simply left that area and moved to another part of the island. But it's certainly something to be concerned about when we start to see some of these more dramatic declines. And also a thing to keep in mind is some of these species, such as the golden white-eye, rufous fantail, and bridal white-eye, tend to flock together. So they'll have small groups that they're kind of found together in. So if maybe this golden white-eye or rufous fantail or bridal white-eye actually leaves that sample station, you automatically have a decrease in like 15 or 20 bird counts, or the abundance. You have a decrease in 15 or 20 birds at that point. And that may also be explaining why we see some huge shifts. So maybe they left the area and they moved somewhere a little bit further down the road. So that might be some of the explanations for this. When we shift to look at the nectivores and frugivores, so these are the bird species on Saipan that are depending on nectar from the flowers or fruits from the fruit trees, we start to see what appears to be decline. Some of these population trends can get quite messy. As you can imagine, the populations are always fluctuating, as we can see in these graphs. They're kind of jumping up and around. Again, this is depending on detections. So it appears to be that there might be some decline. And I guess the big question here is, are these stable, or are the frugivores experiencing a lag time in their population recovery due to vegetation damage and not having availability to food resources such as fruits and nectars and things along those lines. Moving forward with Tinian and looking at the carnivores, insectivores, and omnivores, again, we see some erratic population trends, but some seem stable, other ones seem to maybe having less detections in areas. Tinian, nectivores, and frugivores, we're seeing fairly stable patterns, except for the guy in the middle, which is the Micronesian honeyeater. So this is a nectivore. We're seeing a change in detection following essentially the typhoon events. We move on to Rota, looking at carnivores, insectivores, and omnivores. We can see there can be some stable trends, also some slowly declining trends as well. But generally speaking, it doesn't look quite as bad as Saipan did. And when we look at the nectivores and frugivores, we can see that they actually have a pretty stable trend line. So yes, there's a change point on some of these, but it looks like they dipped down and then they had a recovery period, and maybe something happened in 2010. The biggest one for concern is this white-throated ground dove. There's a huge change point that occurs back here in 2017. But if you look at the data, you can see that detections were always pretty low until about 2017. We had this huge spike, and this might be kind of influencing how this change point occurred. Without this spike, it almost seems like the detection rates that we're currently seeing are pretty consistent with what we have seen historically. So in summary, each island seems to be showing different patterns. We feel like we're definitely seeing some declines on Saipan and Tinian. And it's not surprising because we had two major typhoon events that happened in succession within a 3-year time frame. These are the islands that are also under the most development pressure, so changes to the landscape around the sampling sites can greatly impact our detection, and that's something we should be also kind of looking at. We've attempted to look at land use, land cover change over time around these stations. It needs a little bit more work, I think, before we can actually come out and make some comments about what's going on with that. Another thing to keep in mind is some of this older data that tends to really set the baseline for some of these species population trends tend to be more erratic. And this looks like it might be related to observer bias. So prior to roughly 2010, there were several different people. I can't remember the exact number off the top of my head, but there was a lot of people doing these surveys. They're all going to listen to bird species and interpret information a little bit differently. So there's a potential for this observer bias, whereas after 2010, some of these detections tended to be more consistent. So it's possible that this older data from 1991 to mid 2000s might be kind of influencing these population trends in a maybe not the best way. Generally speaking, it seems that Rota appears to be more stable. The typhoon events were more spread out. They're also less intense. They were category 2s. Rota also has less development pressure, and there ends up being, obviously a higher degree of native forest cover found on Rota, which kind of led me to the question, all right, well, what if Tongan is the actual cause? Tongan's fairly brittle when it's these monocultural stands. It can break off during typhoon events, but it also appears to be one of the species that recovers and leaves out fairly quickly following these events. Personal observations, it seems to be one of the first species to actually come out and start recovering. It doesn't necessarily provide food resources in terms of fruit and nectar, but it does provide habitat for insects and lizards and things like that. So it does provide food resources for the carnivores, omnivores. And what we're planning on doing or what we did was we actually took 343 forest plots that were sampled from 2018 through 2020 on Saipan. We took this data, we classified these plots into community types based on the species composition, the density of the trees, and as well as cover in terms of basal area. And I broke out 3 different plant communities that I'm going to display data on in a minute. And that's the Tongan monocultures, the native forest, and these mixed introduced forests that have some, generally speaking, some sort of Tongan component, maybe in the understory. We're going to take that EVI data that I just presented, we're going to stratify it by the plant community type, and we're going to see if Tongan actually recovers quicker than native limestone forest, and maybe that's kind of helping to explain some of these trend lines. And when we do that, we end up with mixed introduced forest in orange, the native forest in green, and Tongan in red. And what we essentially see after Sotalor and U2 is the exact same trend lines that we saw with EVI when we were splitting it out by wet and dry season. And one thing I think is kind of interesting is I kind of expected to see huge spikes in these red EVI bars following these typhoon events. And it seems to be that most of the vegetation is kind of moving in tandem with each other. There's no extreme differences between each one of these groupings, but we still see that 1 year lag time in 2016 and that 1 dry season recovery in 2019. And part of this is we're only looking at a partial picture. The vegetation index is great to kind of do these landscape level analyses, but it's not providing the full picture in the terms that it doesn't account for lag times and vegetation fruiting due to stress or actual structural damage. So what if typhoon disturbances are opening pathways for Tongan? And we don't quite have that answer yet. And I think we're going to have some surveys coming out in late it's 2022, it's not 2021, where we're going to resurvey 89 vegetation plots that were sampled in 2017, so pre-U2, and look at species composition and structural change. And I think that might provide more information, at least into figuring out if Tongans using, well, not using, but typhoon are providing a pathway for Tongan expansion across the island. So you might be saying, Brad, how is all this related to invasive species and climate change? As I mentioned before, some climate change trajectories look like there's going to be more frequent intense storm events. And these typhoon events could be stressing the populations in terms of the bird populations. And we know that it stresses vegetation, and vegetation is going to have a recovery period. How's that influence the bird populations? So one thought is we should potentially be providing food security through for wildlife through replanting native fruit tree species. This makes sense. So when there is a typhoon event, hopefully there is enough habitat that's not impacted that they continue the fruit and provide food resources for these species. I think the obvious solution might be to replant Tongan forests with native fruit trees. It seems pretty straightforward, but there's one problem. I'd like to introduce you to the Nightingale reed warbler, in Chamorro known as Gaga kurisu. The Nightingale reed warbler, Gaga kurisu, is a federally endangered species only found on Saipan and Alamagan. And we've long known that it utilizes the Tongan habitat. It seems to utilize those areas quite frequently. In 2019 and 2020, we misnetted 30 individuals. We attached a transmitter to their backs, and we followed their movements using satellite telemetry to understand better home range estimates, as well as how they're utilizing different habitat types. And just as we kind of thought, it ends up that they highly utilize the Tongan habitat in mixed introduced forests. And this becomes a problem because if we want to remove the Tongan, now we're essentially disturbing habitat for a globally endangered species. To make things even worse or further complicated, our lower 3 islands are constantly under threat from brown tree snake invasions, the same snake that decimated bird populations on our neighboring island of Guam. And there's certainly considerable and great effort to prevent brown tree snake introductions from both Guam and CNMI agencies. Is every airplane that leaves Guam is searched, every boat and cargo ship is visually searched, and they also have trained dogs that go out and sniff for the snakes. There's airport trapping. There's all kinds of programs designed to prevent the snake from leaving Guam. When planes land in Saipan, they're inspected in the same manner and things along those lines. And there's early detection rapid response programs. There's an entire set of breeding bird survey data points that I didn't present on. They're actually located around our airports and seaports. So if we see a huge decline in areas around our airports and seaports, we know that we might have a problem with the brown tree snake. But the big question is, what happens if there's an increased frequency of typhoon events? The bird populations are being impacted in some way. There's resulting habitat degradation and a brown tree snake invasion all happen at once. This is a potentially likely situation. So when we do have the typhoon events that have occurred here, there's a lot of humanitarian aid that gets flown in to help support things like power and water interruptions. So that just means increased flights, increased stress on these agencies to make sure they're checking for brown tree snake, make sure there's no brown tree snake introduction. So what would happen? Big trouble could potentially happen. We could be facing some potential localized extinctions on whatever island the brown tree snake may take hold of. But there's good news. Luckily, we had some very forward-thinking biologists within our team at the Division of Fish and Wildlife, as well with our partner agencies with the United States Fish and Wildlife Service, Pacific Bird Conservation, and Association of Zoos and Aquariums, and they came up with the Marianas Aviflora Conservation Program and Plan. And the whole idea of this plan is to do assisted introductions, AKA translocations, of native bird species from our lower, more susceptible islands to some of these isolated northern islands. And the idea here is to create redundable, valuable satellite populations of native birds. There's 8 species that are set to be translocated to 6 target islands by 2034. The first release was in 2008. And the latest release just happened last week on Wednesday, where we translocated 20 fruit doves to Guam, one of our northern islands. As you can imagine, there's a considerable amount of effort that goes into these translocations. The DFW team here will go out and do pre-translocation expeditions to survey the target islands where we might consider bringing birds. We're looking at bird species composition to determine if we translocate species X, is it going to be competing with the species that are already occurring on that island? We do vegetation surveys to determine habitat suitability for the target species. And we're also typically looking at invasive species surveys, mainly in terms of rats and feral ungulates. None of our native species are translocated to an island where it doesn't already co-occur with the species that are already present there. And that's one way to hopefully ensure that we're not creating a huge amount of problems when we translocate one of these species from the southern end. The Pacific Bird Conservation Group typically flies in and they help us capture and ban the birds for translocation. The Association of Zoos and Aquariums actually provides veterinarians to monitor the birds' health while they're in captivity. So they're looking at parasite and disease loads. They're monitoring the weight while they're in captivity to make sure that the birds are healthy. They're looking at the body composition, fat content and things along those lines, and they're ensuring that the diet is adequate. The bird is brought to the island and translocated, and then DFW follows up hopefully within a couple of years. They do post-translocation surveys and recite of the banded birds to determine survivorship. We're also looking at birds that are unbanded. We know that if we did a translocation of a banded species and we start seeing unbanded occurrences, we know that they're actually reproducing. So this is typically what one of those translocations might look like, at least when we get to the island to actually release the birds. So the big white boat in the background is the mothership where the birds are being stored. We're taking a skiff. We're going to the island of Guam with these birds that are located in the boxes. The boxes are offloaded on shore. They're put on backpacks, essentially. They're trucked up into the jungle, and then they're released into the wild. And I have a short video just showing a release that happened in 2017 on the island of Guam. The individuals on the right-hand side are the veterinarians, wildlife staff are on the left, and the birds are being released into their new habitat and home. And a lot of pictures actually happen at that time. So, tie everything together, in conclusion, we think we have good evidence that there's repeated typhoon events are impacting bird populations, at least in some capacity, whether they're directly impacting the bird and there's on decline, or if they're actually moving because the habitat's actually being destroyed and they're moving around the island. We know that our species have limited time and space to actually adapt to these impacts. So there's not a lot of time, and these islands are small, and there's not a lot of ways for them to move around. It's a little unclear if these typhoon events are actually creating pathways for invasive tree species expansion. And this is something we hope to get more information on within the next coming year by doing some of those resurveys of vegetation plots. But the combined effects of weakened populations and invasive species interactions could be catastrophic. And extinctions equal gigantic trouble, big trouble. But there is hope, and we at least have a program in place to help establish satellite populations that hopefully provide an avenue for ensuring that these species actually survive. I just want to quickly give acknowledgement to a lot of the funding for our research is provided by the United States Fish and Wildlife Service Wildlife and Sports Fish Restoration Program. And it's not just me, obviously, doing some of this work. There's a ton of people involved on various projects that kind of went in to get the information for this talk. And I hope I didn't leave anyone out, but there's certainly a lot of wildlife staff that are involved in these projects. And with that, I want to thank you for attending the webinar, and I'll open up the floor for any questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Brad, for your amazing presentation. Thank you for including lots of photos too of CNMI's beautiful endemic bird populations. It's great to see them and all of your efforts. Yeah, this was a really great example of how your team is managing for risk under really high uncertainty, right? Where these strong ecological trajectories and the potential ecosystem transformations are unknown, and that kind of overwhelms the existing approaches that we might have to model those interactions. And so you combined this kind of available but coarser scale EVI data and precipitation data with these more local scale observations, and then testing both the management responses to change and the species responses to ecosystem change is helping inform those management plans going forward. So it's a really cool example, I think, of how a lot of us in the Pacific are kind of taking the information that we have under this huge umbrella of uncertainty and trying to just stepwise iterate and manage in the future. So we have plenty of time for questions. Feel free to unmute yourself, make yourself visible, raise your hand, drop a message in the chat. I'll call on whoever I can see. Maybe I'll just quickly ask Brad, are there publications that are available as resources yet with this work?
Yeah, there's a couple of manuscripts that we have planned out. At least for the EVI stuff, I'd like to get a little bit better of an understanding, try to incorporate more vegetation data from on the ground. But I think you kind of hit the nail on the head there too, where it's like, by the time we collect enough data to actually get a better understanding, it could be too late at that point. So we're trying to use the best information that we can and tie it in at coarser degrees into finer scale information. But yeah, I would hope that these manuscripts will be forthcoming in the next year or so, or something along those lines.
Cool. Well, as things become available, definitely let us know and send it out to the group. Thanks, Brad.
Yep, certainly.
Corey, I see your hands up. Go for it.
Thanks so much for that presentation, Brad. Can you hear me okay?
I can. I'm going to pop in my other earbud just to make sure.
I can speak up too. Sorry if I missed it at the beginning. I was curious about if diversity and population sizes, how those differ among the three islands in terms of the bird populations and diversity.
Yep, certainly. So there are different species, obviously, between the three islands, and there are also some not common, but species that are found across all the islands. And I think trying to get an idea of how the population estimates are, the BBS data is actually like roadside survey data. So the nice thing is it's frequent data, but it's not always traversing the jungle type information that we're collecting. We do these island-wide surveys. They happen more infrequent, but they're way more substantial sampling points. And we have one for Saipan that we collected in 2018. We were working on the data. We had Typhoon U2 that really set us back quite a bit. Then we had COVID that came not so far after that. And we're finally getting around to analyzing it. I think that'll give us a better estimate on the populations of birds on Saipan. The data, the island-wide survey we're actually conducting right at this moment is on Rota. So we'll also get a better population estimate on Rota. And we had planned during COVID times to do Tinian, but we're hoping to also tie all this information into these, more robust kind of samples that we're collecting population information on. But going back to kind of what you were talking about, it seems to be that Saipan has maybe more diversity in terms of bird species. And again, it's also the one probably under the most development pressure. But there are kind of, coming back to what you're asking, there are kind of different species located on these islands and some that co-occur on all of them. Does that answer your question? Okay, thank you.
Thanks, Brad. There's two questions in the chat that are sort of related from Jeff Burgett and Christy Martin. And Jeff asks, can you share any preliminary data on translocated bird population growth and survival? And then Christy sort of follows up and says, are you seeing anything unexpected among those translocated species? And if I've mischaracterized your questions, guys, let me know.
Yep, certainly. Actually spoke to the expedition team that just got back from the Guam release, and they did follow-up resurveys. I spoke to them this morning. They got back at 4 a.m. And he had said that they're seeing the populations of the birds that they had brought over seem to be responding quite well. There's one species that they didn't quite see. It's only been a few years, but it's the Marianas fruit dove. It's probably going to take a little bit longer for that population to stabilize, to actually reproduce. Some of the smaller birds that we brought over, they kind of repopulate rather quickly. And they're actually seeing, in terms of those birds, at least, that they are reproducing. They saw birds that didn't have bands, so we know they're actually reproducing on the island, which means that we feel pretty good that the translocations were successful. There was an interesting, hopefully that answers part of your question, Jeff. And I think the data that they're collecting is also going to be analyzed and probably produced in a publication as well at some point, but it's still being analyzed. Chrissy, I think that is an excellent question. We were on the island just north of Saipan. It's called Anatahan. This island erupted 20 years ago, completely covered the island in ashfall. And U.S. Fish and Wildlife did some very pointed surveys there in 2010, but no one's been back, at least from our end, in 20 years. So we went there and we heard the birds that we've known that have always been historically documented there, which is good. So somehow this volcanic eruption, there were bird populations that survived. There hasn't been any birds translocated on that island, and we were scoping it out for translocation, and we heard one species that's never been recorded there, but it was translocated to the island of Saipan just north of it. So the question is, did this individual fly over from the island of Saipan and do an unintentional introduction onto Anatahan, which the species composition shouldn't be a problem, but maybe this is something that I don't think anyone ever thought might happen, that we might have inadvertently introduced a Marianas fruit dove to the island of Anatahan. Or maybe they occurred there before and no one just ever recorded them. The island's quite huge and it's hard to traverse. But I think that's a good example for your question where we're like, uh-oh, did something weird happen or was it always there?
Thanks, Brad. Thanks, Jeff and Christy. If anyone else has questions, you can drop them in the chat or raise your hand. I might ask a quick one, maybe quick, while we're waiting. The tropical cyclone events that were followed by the unusually dry seasons, Brad. I think, in general, there's a fairly good consensus under future climate projections anyway, that tropical cyclone and typhoon intensity is likely to increase in the area around CNMI, which might mean more severe damage. And I wonder what that might mean for the dry season activity, and especially thinking about U2, which was such a strong event, historically strong, followed, that your statement that it was potentially even a compounding type of event series where you have a serious, severe typhoon followed by an unusually dry year, which was 2020. And wondering what are the kind of conversations around management that might be happening.
Yeah, that's a good question. I think that's looking at this data is going to spark some questions, thinking about how do we prepare for this uncertainty. And I don't quite have a good answer for that at the moment, but I certainly think it's something that we should be considering, particularly as I showed, Saipan and Tinian hit two extreme typhoon events within a 3-year period. So even last year, we're all sitting here wondering if we're going to get hit another 3 years out, and what does that mean? But yeah, certainly I think I don't quite have a good answer for that at this moment, but it's something on our radar, and how do we at least get a better estimate of what's going on with these birds, and then make sure that the trend lines we're seeing seem to be kind of coinciding with that compounding event. But yeah, it's a lot to think about.
I agree. It's kind of overwhelming, but thanks. Thanks for that. In the chat, Jeff commented that it sounds like surge capacity for brown tree snake interdiction is a big need. But people will be torn between helping their families and neighbors or safeguarding the island. What kind of planning and prep go into this? And I'm not sure exactly what you mean, Jeff, by surge capacity. If you can unmute yourself.
Yeah, I just mean having people, more than you would ordinarily need because of the event.
Yeah, good question. I have not been involved in any of the brown tree snake sightings since I've been here, but the plan is we're all hands on deck type situation when someone calls in. They even report a brown tree snake, and there is, I hope I don't mess this up. I think there's 3 weeks of surveys around the area where the brown tree snake may happen. So there's searches for obviously the brown tree snake. They're looking at lizard compositions to see and bird compositions to see if there's a decrease in what would be deemed prey items for that brown tree snake. So during that typhoon event, my understanding is we're still on call and we'd be responding to that event. So there should be at least hopefully some capacity to help address that issue if it were to come up. And the same time coming home to no power and potentially decreases in water supply. Does that answer your question, Jeff?
Yeah, thanks. It just seemed like it's a kind of a tough situation for people to be in, that because obviously human needs are paramount for people, but you don't want to let anything slip through. So I just kind of feel for you guys having to be prepared for that all the time.
Yeah, I will say, kind of on a side note, the recovery effort that I saw here, I was here for U2, I wasn't here for Sodalore. The events during Sodalore, people didn't have power for like 4 months. And with FEMA money coming in, they've built the infrastructure up. So like immediately after U2, FEMA was here, taking all of our power poles and replacing them with concrete power lines. And we had a lot faster response after U2, which was a bigger storm than Sodalore, than we did previously for Sodalore. So hopefully that kind of factors into what you were discussing, that maybe there's recovery in terms of infrastructure, stability in terms of power and water, that it helps benefit us in that scenario.
Thanks, Brad and Jeff. I can see Glenn has his hand up. Go for it, Glenn.
Yeah, I just wanted to make a comment relating back to Jeff's question. Like during a I guess storm event or a natural disaster, from the Pacific Plant Protection Organization and the FAO, they recognize, or they have recognized, the occurrence of, or the need for, I guess, more capacity during natural disaster events, wherein priorities change to get in aid, and potentially invasive species sneaking in on this aid that's coming in. Stuff needs to come in, resources, people, infrastructure needs to be repaired. So there is guidance out there that is I guess I don't know how to say it, but it's gone through the FAO and it's passed. It's actually shoot, I forget the word for it. Either way, but through the International Standards of Phytosanitary Measures, there's guidance that's given out to different countries whenever there is a natural disaster to help prevent the introductions of like probably brown tree snake or any other invasive species. But yeah, I just wanted to put that out there. If I ever find the actual guidance, I'll send it out to you guys. Sorry.
Thanks, Glenn. I see Jeff's got a thumbs up. And I know we're at the top of the hour. So as a reminder, this webinar recording will be made available on pacificrisc.org. But if anyone wants to stay on and ask another last and short question, feel free. Otherwise, thank you very much, Brad. That was a fascinating talk. It was great to have an example of these complex issues and conservation efforts from outside of Hawaii for our webinar series. So thank you again for being willing to share all the hard work that you've been doing with us today. And with that, thanks everyone for joining, and we'll see you next time at our next webinar, to be determined.
Thank you, everyone.